Hello, class. This is your Professor Daryl Fisher. Here in Chapter 12, we are learning about the brain. Chapter 11 was our introduction to the nervous system and the neuron and the dendrites, the soma cell body, the axon, local potentials, action potentials, how signals are sent, synapses, the connections between neurons and their target cells, and how it can be an electrical synapse or a chemical synapse with using a neurotransmitter. And now we go into in the next couple chapters, we'll go into the major sections of the nervous system, which are the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. But chapter 12, we talk about the central nervous system, which you'll remember is the brain and the spinal cord. Start off with an overview. All right, so our central nervous system includes our brain and spinal cord. It helps with our movements, and so, being able to lift my hand up, it's being controlled by even though my arm is what's moving, my brain is doing the controlling. Interpreting sensory information. I'm able to see the books behind me in my screen. I'm able to hear my own voice due to things being processed and sensory information being processed in my brain. My brain right now is helping maintain my homeostasis, my body temperature, my fluid balances, making sure I have enough, the right balance of fluid in my body. In my bloodstream, for instance, it can't be too viscous or too watery. And also different functions relating to the mind, my emotions, my consciousness. It's all in my brain. Right? The functions of the nervous system, which we've already discussed, so I'm not going to go into a whole bunch of detail. Motor functions, that's movement, also gland secretion. Remember sweat glands, sebaceous glands in your epithelial, your epidermis, and your dermis, your cutaneous membrane in your skin. Those are a function of the peripheral nervous system. Your sensory functions, detection of sensations, also a function of your peripheral nervous system, but they work in conjunction with your central nervous system. Because all of the peripheral nervous system, your motor and your sensory, sends information to be processed in your central nervous system. So that's your decision making, your interpretation. I sense, like I can see this computer screen with my eyes, but that's my peripheral nervous system, but it sends the signal to my brain, and my brain is what tells me that what I'm seeing is the computer screen. Planning, monitoring movement, maintaining homeostasis, speaking. The fact that I'm able to speak right now, that those words are being created in my central nervous system, and then the signal is sent to my tongue and to my vocal cords to be able to make the sounds that you are able to hear. The brain is soft, whitish gray. Now, we talked about the white and the gray, myelinated and unmyelinated neurons and cell bodies and dendrites. Whitish gray anatomically continuous with the spinal cord. The brain and the spinal cord are very much connected. Resides in the cranial cavity in your skull. That's in that cranial cavity, which is houses the skull, the meninges, everything in conjunction with the brain, cerebral spinal fluid. Very important, all very important, and it controls most of the body's functions. And remember, it controls a lot of things in conjunction with the endocrine system, your hormones. So don't forget that, even as we talk about the nervous system. Weighs between, you see here, 1250 and 1450 grams. Mostly nervous tissue, mostly, not all, but there's also epithelial and connective tissue. Remember, the brain is an organ, therefore has multiple tissue types working together for a specific function. The brain does contain ventricles, which are these cavities, which are filled with cerebral spinal fluid. And it receives 20% of total blood flow during rest. So if you're not exercising, if you're not moving, if you're not running around, 20% of your blood flow goes to your brain. That's very, very important. So when someone's heart stops beating, and one of the main reasons why we do cardiopulmonary resuscitation is because blood is vital to the function of your brain, right? So it needs huge amounts of oxygen to continue to be able to do what it's, remember the thinking requires energy, sending electrical signals, action potentials in your brain requires energy. Therefore, lots of oxygen and glucose and nutrients are used by the brain, which is supplied by your bloodstream. And so when your heart stops beating, one of the main reasons we want to pump and try to get the heart beating again is for your brain. We're going to divide the brain up a lot in this chapter. So you're going to see a lot as we not only divide the brain into its four major divisions, but then we're going to take this cerebrum and divide that into multiple different parts as well. So there's going to be a lot of note taking in this section, right? But the four main sections of the brain are the cerebrum, diencephalon, cerebellum, and brainstem. Now, cerebrum, that's the part of the brain we generally think of when we think of the brain, right? When someone has a brain injury, when someone is talking about the part of the brain that allows them to be able to talk, be able to think, remember, they're generally talking about the cerebrum. But the other sections, diencephalon, the cerebellum, and the brainstem also play major roles in the brain, as you see here on this chart. Okay. All right, starting off with the cerebrum, enlarged superior portion of the brain, divides into the left and right cerebral hemispheres, and we'll talk about that. Cerebral hemisphere is further divided into 5 lobes. We're going to talk about the different lobes of the cerebrum. So it's not only divided into 2 hemispheres. If you cut it in half, that line down the middle of your cerebrum, but it also is divided into lobe, frontal, occipital. We'll talk about the different lobes, and it's responsible for your higher mental functions, learning, memory, personality, cognition. Usually if there's an issue with the brain, mental issues, it's derived in the cerebrum. The encephalon, underneath the cerebral hemispheres, it's like your core of your brain. It's 4 distinct structural and functional parts. So we'll divide that up as well. This is for processing, integrating, relaying information to different parts of the brain. The brain is very connected. Different parts of the brain work together constantly. Homeostatic functions, regulation of movement, biological rhythms. The cerebellum, posterior, inferior, bottom portion of your brain. Also divided into left and right hemispheres. This one works with planning and coordinating of movements, especially playing in sport. This is the part of the brain used a lot in athletes. And then we have the brain stem, which basically is continuous with the spinal cord, and that's the part of the brain involved in involuntary homeostatic functions, control of certain reflexes. You'll see how we control things like breathing, very, very important things that we do without even thinking. You do all through the night. You'll see these and how these are controlled by these parts of the brain. All right, so that's your diagram again, your basic structure of the brain, the cerebrum, the big structure here, the diencephalon, cerebellum in the back, bottom, and the brain stem that leads right to the spinal cord. Your spinal cord is long tubular organ enclosed within the protective vertebral cavity. So in your vertebrae, in your spinal column, blends with the inferior portion of the brainstem. So your brainstem goes right into your spinal cord. It's almost hard to tell sometimes where one ends and the other begins. But we generally say it ends between, that the spinal cord ends between the first and second lumbar vertebrae in the back. And you'll notice that your spinal column keeps going further than the spinal cord actually ends. It's 43 to 46 centimeters, about 17 to 18 inches in length, depending on obviously your height and things like that. Has a central canal, internal cavity within the spinal cord, which is continuous with the brain's ventricles and is filled with cerebrospinal fluid. So cerebrospinal fluid is not only in the brain and the ventricles in the brain, but also in your spinal cord. And we'll talk about the characteristics of that and its ability to be able to add protection to your brain and spinal cord. Remember, we have white and gray matter. We have mentioned this before. White matter is both in the brain and the spinal cord, consists of myelinated axons. Remember, those are oligodendrocytes in the brain, and the Schwann cells, oligodendrocytes in the CNS and Schwann cells in the PNS help myelinate neurons, which provides insulation so that the signals can be sent quicker, they can be faster and more efficient. So each lobe of the cerebrum contains bundles of white matter, we call it tracts, which receive input from and send output to clusters of cell bodies and dendrites in the cerebral gray matter, which is called the nuclei. Spinal cord contains white matter tracts as well, shuttle information processed by nuclei and spinal gray matter, right? So they both have white matter, which are myelinated axons. Remember, cell bodies are not myelinated, dendrites are not myelinated, and there are some axons that are not myelinated. That would be considered gray matter, both in the brain and spinal cord, neuron cell bodies, dendrites, and unmyelinated axons. Outer few millimeters of the cerebrum is gray matter. Deeper portions of the brain are mostly white matter. Spinal cord is a little different. Mostly gray matter in the cord center processes information surrounded by tracts of white matter on the outside. So they're just reversed. The brain has outer on the outside gray matter, inside white matter. Spinal cord inside gray matter, on the outside white matter. Communication between gray and white matter connects different regions of the brain and the spinal cord with one another. Myelinated axons enable near instantaneous communication, right? So we need that myelination. Remember, we said with multiple sclerosis, you sort of eat away at that myelination. Autoimmune disease that eats away at its own myelination, therefore slows their body's function down because the signals get slowed down. Well, your body needs that myelination. Therefore, the brain and the spinal cord communicate very well with different parts because they have these myelinated parts, this white matter. And that is the structure that we see here. Look at the cerebrum. You have gray on the outside and then white on the inside. That's super fast on the inside. And then in the spinal cord, you have gray on the inside and then the white matter on the outside.